Maria had always been different from the women people usually imagined when they thought of wealth and luxury. She was the kind of woman who found peace in small things. She loved watching the morning sun slip through her window, she enjoyed the smell of fresh bread from the local bakery, and she could spend hours in her garden, touching the petals of her roses with gentle fingers. To her, this was wealth, moments of calmness, beauty, and love. Even though her life had changed drastically after marrying Richard, a man whose name was known across countries, she never allowed that change to take away her simplicity. Before marriage, Maria lived an ordinary life. She grew up in a small town where people cared more about one another than about brands or money. Her father worked as a schoolteacher, and her mother stitched clothes for neighbors to earn a little extra. Maria herself helped in household chores, carried groceries home from the market, and studied under the yellow light of a simple lamp when electricity failed. There was no glamour, but there was warmth. From those days, she learned that dignity never depended on what one wore, but on how one treated others. When Maria met Richard, it was not in a grand ballroom or an expensive event as some might imagine. It was in a library, a quiet corner where she was reading a book about history. Richard, dressed casually, was also reading in the same section. They spoke for the first time when both reached for the same book. Their laughter over the coincidence turned into a conversation, and that conversation became the beginning of something beautiful. At that time, Maria did not even know who Richard truly was. To her, he was just a kind man with warm eyes and genuine interest in her thoughts. Only later did she discover that he was the owner of a growing airline company and one of the most successful men in the business world. But by then, her heart had already chosen him for his simplicity, not his status. Richard himself was impressed by Maria's calmness. He had met many people who wanted to be around him for his wealth, but Maria was different. She never asked about his money, never spoke about his cars, or his house, or his fame. She asked about his dreams, about what made him happy, and about his childhood memories. It touched him in a way nothing else had. When they married, Maria's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. Suddenly, there were mansions, private cars, expensive jewelry, and wardrobes filled with clothes she had never dreamed of wearing. Yet, Maria did not lose herself in those things. The first time Richard bought her a diamond necklace, she thanked him but quietly placed it in a box, saying she would rather wear the small pendant her mother had given her years ago. To her, it was not about rejecting gifts, but about holding on to what mattered most to her heart. Servants and staff sometimes whispered in surprise at her choices. While other rich wives went shopping in Paris or spent hours at salons, Maria often went to the local market, choosing vegetables herself and smiling at the sellers. She wore simple dresses, often repeating them without hesitation. She walked without makeup when she wished, and sometimes people thought she was just another ordinary woman. Maria did not mind. In fact, she felt more comfortable blending into the crowd than standing out with flashing jewelry. Richard admired this deeply. He often told her that her simplicity kept him grounded. For a man who lived in meetings, negotiations, and figures, Maria was like a breath of fresh air. She reminded him of life beyond business. He used to say, "Maria, with you, I remember who I am, not just what I own." That sentence always made her smile. Even though Maria had access to luxury, she never allowed it to define her. When traveling, she sometimes chose economy class if she was alone, not because she could not afford more, but because she felt comfortable sitting among people and observing life closely. She loved listening to conversations, watching how mothers comforted children on flights, and how people smiled when the plane touched down safely. Those small human experiences gave her more joy than a glass of expensive wine in first class. Her modesty was not an act, it was who she truly was. People who met her for the first time were often surprised. They expected arrogance, but instead found kindness. Once, during a charity event, Maria noticed a nervous waitress drop a tray of glasses. While others frowned, Maria stood up, helped pick the glasses, and smiled warmly at the young girl, whispering that mistakes were only proof of effort. The waitress never forgot that moment, and neither did the people who saw it. In many ways, Maria carried her small-town heart into a world of skyscrapers and private jets. Her childhood had been her teacher, shaping her into someone who valued humility over pride. She always remembered her father's words, "Respect is earned by how you treat others, not by what you own." And that belief guided her in every step. She was not blind to the privileges around her. She knew people often looked at her as the wife of a billionaire. But to Maria, those labels did not mean much. She saw herself as Maria, a daughter, a friend, and a woman who believed in kindness. Being Richard's wife was something she was proud of, but it was not the only thing that defined her. When she traveled with Richard, staff often recognized them immediately and offered the best of everything. Yet, when she traveled alone, her plain dressing often confused people. She did not wear flashy designer clothes or handbags with famous logos. She preferred comfort, soft cotton, light colors, and shoes that allowed her to walk easily. To some, she looked like an ordinary traveler. But Maria never thought of correcting anyone's assumptions. She simply moved along, carrying her grace quietly. Her friends sometimes asked why she did not enjoy the benefits of her position more openly. Maria would laugh and say, "Luxury is not bad, but it should not become a cage. If I forget how to live simply, then I lose the person I am." Those words reflected the depth of her thinking. In her private life, she lived with gratitude. She loved cooking for Richard sometimes, surprising him with meals that reminded him of his childhood. Though chefs prepared gourmet food in their house, Richard always said nothing tasted as good as Maria's home-cooked dishes. Maria felt the same way. It was never about perfection but about love. The world saw Richard as a powerful billionaire, but in their home, he was a husband, and Maria treated him with warmth rather than awe. She supported his work silently, never trying to step into the spotlight. She knew his world was full of attention, cameras, and expectations. That was why she made sure home was his safe space, a place where he could simply be himself without judgment. Maria's life looked like a fairy tale to outsiders, but she knew it was not the wealth that made it so. It was the values she carried, the love she shared with Richard, and the quiet joy she found in everyday life. She remained true to herself despite everything. And that very nature, the simplicity she held onto, was the reason people underestimated her at times. They saw plain clothes and a gentle face, but they never imagined the world of influence that quietly stood behind her. And it was this very simplicity, the choice to live without showing off, that would one day lead to a moment no one on a certain flight would ever forget. The morning of her journey began quietly, the way Maria liked it. She had packed her bag the night before, choosing only what she truly needed. Instead of expensive designer luggage, she carried a simple leather bag that had been with her for years. It was not flashy, but it was strong and familiar. She wore a soft blue dress, neat but plain, and tied her hair in a simple bun. To anyone else, she looked like a woman traveling modestly, perhaps a teacher or an ordinary housewife. To Maria, she looked exactly how she wanted to look, comfortable and true to herself. Her destination was important. She was going to visit a close friend who had been unwell. Richard had meetings abroad, so she was traveling alone. Richard, knowing she would be flying with his airline, arranged her first-class ticket as always, but Maria had never treated such things as a privilege. To her, it was just another seat on a plane, a place where she could rest during the long journey. She arrived at the airport with plenty of time, smiled at the staff at the counter, and handed over her passport. The young man at the desk checked her ticket and printed her boarding pass without much notice. He looked at her once more, perhaps surprised at her simple appearance, but said nothing. Maria thanked him politely and went ahead. When it was time to board, passengers stood in line. The airline staff called for first-class travelers, and Maria quietly joined the group. Around her, people were dressed in sharp suits and elegant dresses. Jewelry sparkled under the airport lights, and designer bags were clutched carefully. Maria, holding her plain leather bag, stood calmly, not comparing herself with anyone. She simply followed the line as the staff checked her pass and let her through. Inside the plane, the first-class section looked grand, as it always did. Wide seats, soft lighting, and attendants ready to serve. Maria walked to her seat, found her spot near the window, and placed her bag gently above in the overhead compartment. She sat down with ease, smiling at the thought of reading her book during the flight. For her, it was not about luxury, it was about having some quiet hours with herself. But not everyone saw it that way. A man sitting a few seats away noticed her first. He was dressed in a dark suit, a gold watch shining on his wrist, and he raised his eyebrows as he looked at Maria's simple outfit. He leaned toward the woman next to him and whispered something that made her cover her mouth with a little laugh. Maria heard but chose not to react. She had faced such moments before. People often judged her by her clothes, not knowing who she truly was. Soon, one of the flight attendants approached. She was polite but carried a slight hesitation in her voice. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Maria handed it over without question. The attendant checked it, looked at Maria, then checked it again. The seat number was correct. Still, doubt lingered in her eyes. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, trying to sound gentle but unable to hide her uncertainty. Maria smiled kindly. "Yes, it is," she said. "Is there a problem?" The attendant hesitated. She was not rude, but she seemed confused. "It's just, first class is fully booked today, and we want to make sure there hasn't been a mistake." She looked around, almost expecting others to nod in agreement. Some passengers shifted in their seats, whispering, watching the scene unfold with interest. Maria stayed calm. "There is no mistake," she replied in her soft voice. "This is my seat. Here is my boarding pass." The attendant gave a small nod, but doubt remained on her face. She walked away, perhaps to confirm with her supervisor. Maria sat back quietly, opening her book, pretending not to notice the glances around her. She was used to being underestimated, and it did not hurt her pride. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a little sting, not because she was doubted, but because respect was once again tied to appearances in the eyes of strangers. After a few minutes, another attendant returned, this time with a firmer tone. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but it seems there has been an error with your ticket. You might need to move to economy class. Can you please gather your belongings?" The words spread like a wave through the cabin. Some passengers smirked, others looked at Maria with curiosity. One man even muttered, "Knew it? She doesn't belong here." The woman beside him giggled as if it were entertainment. Maria looked up at the attendant, still holding her book in her lap. She did not raise her voice or show anger. "I believe there is no mistake," she said gently. "My ticket is correct. Would you like to check with your manager?" The firmness in her tone surprised the attendant. She hesitated, nodded quickly, and walked away again. Maria remained seated, her calmness confusing the passengers who expected her to leave quietly in embarrassment. She closed her book, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out of the window, letting her thoughts drift. She remembered her father's words from childhood, "Never let someone else's opinion decide your worth." At that moment, those words gave her strength. She knew who she was, and no amount of whispering or judgment could take that away. Meanwhile, two attendants spoke near the front, clearly discussing her. Their voices were low, but passengers could see their glances toward Maria. A few minutes later, the senior attendant walked back. This one was more composed, though her expression still carried doubt. Ma'am, she said carefully, there really seems to be an issue. Perhaps if you could move for now, we'll sort it out later. Maria looked at her kindly. I understand your concern, she said, but I have the right ticket for this seat. Please check again with your records. I'm willing to wait. Her polite firmness caught the attention of everyone around. Some passengers grew restless. The man in the dark suit sighed loudly, muttering about delays, while others whispered about how someone like her could even afford first class. Their voices carried tones of disbelief, as if comfort was only meant for those who looked rich. Maria, however, did not let her composure break. She sat there with patience, her posture straight, her eyes calm. If she wanted, she could have revealed her identity, dropped her husband's name, and silenced everyone instantly. But that was not her way. She had always believed that truth did not need to be shouted. It only needed time to reveal itself. Finally, after several minutes of back and forth checking, the staff confirmed that Maria's ticket was indeed correct. The attendant returned, looking a little embarrassed, and gave her a polite nod. Thank you for your patience, ma'am. You may remain in your seat. We apologize for the confusion. Maria smiled warmly. It's quite all right, she said softly. She returned to her book as if nothing had happened. But the cabin was not the same anymore. The whispers continued. Some passengers looked at her differently now, perhaps ashamed of their earlier thoughts, while others still could not believe she belonged there. For Maria, none of it mattered. She had faced such moments before, and she knew this was not the last time. What mattered was that she stayed true to herself, calm and dignified, even when others tried to strip her of it. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Maria leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. She thought of Richard, who would have been upset to know how she had been treated. But she decided she would not tell him yet. She wanted the journey to be peaceful, and she believed in forgiveness. Little did she know, the very people who had doubted her today would soon learn the truth in a way they could never forget. The plane had taken off, and the engines hummed softly as the flight climbed above the clouds. Most passengers settled into their seats, adjusting their screens or opening magazines, but the air around Maria still felt heavy. The earlier scene had not gone unnoticed. Even though the attendants had confirmed her ticket, the looks of doubt and curiosity continued to follow her. Maria leaned back, trying to lose herself in her book again, but it was not easy. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught small glances, people pretending not to stare, then turning quickly when she looked up. She was used to such attention, yet in that moment, it felt different. She was in a space where everyone believed appearances defined value, and her simplicity stood out like a candle in a hall of chandeliers. The man in the dark suit from earlier was still restless. He shifted in his seat, whispered to the woman next to him, and laughed in a way that was not entirely kind. Maria heard fragments of their words, things about how anyone can sneak into places these days and how some people just don't belong. The woman beside him giggled softly, sipping her drink with a satisfied smile, as if Maria's presence had given them entertainment for the flight. Maria kept her eyes on the window, pretending not to hear. She watched the sky turn into layers of soft white clouds, stretching endlessly below. To her, the sight was calming. She thought of her garden back home, of the roses she would water in the early mornings, and of her father's gentle voice reminding her that silence often spoke louder than arguments. Those thoughts steadied her heart. The attendants passed through the aisle, offering warm towels and drinks. When they reached Maria, there was still a trace of hesitation in their service. Though polite, they seemed more cautious with her, as if still unsure whether she truly belonged there. One of them asked, "Would you prefer juice or champagne, ma'am?" Maria smiled and said, "Juice, please." The attendant placed it carefully on her table but did not give the same easy smile she had given to the other passengers. Maria noticed, but she did not let it trouble her. For many in that cabin, wealth was something to display through clothes, through jewelry, through the tone of voice when speaking to staff. Maria, however, had never believed in showing status as proof of worth. She remembered once telling Richard, "If respect depends on diamonds and gold, then it is not respect at all. It is only illusion." This moment reminded her again why she chose to live simply, even if it sometimes made people misjudge her. As the flight continued, whispers spread like threads weaving through the cabin. A few passengers leaned closer to each other, speaking just low enough for her not to catch everything, but their glances revealed the topic. Some wondered if she had borrowed the ticket. Others thought she might be related to someone in staff. A few even assumed she had been mistakenly placed there by the system. None of them thought the truth could be greater than what they imagined. Maria, sitting quietly with her juice, felt the sting of their assumptions. Not because she cared what they thought of her, but because it showed how quickly people judged without knowing. She wondered if any of them considered that perhaps she had worked hard for her place, or that maybe she had her own story. But no, to them, her plain dress was enough proof of who they believed she was. She turned her attention to her book, but her mind wandered. She thought of Richard again, how protective he was, how he never tolerated disrespect toward her. If he had been there, the entire situation would have been different. The attendants would have recognized him instantly, and no one would have dared to question her presence. But then, Maria smiled softly to herself. Perhaps it was better this way. Sometimes it was good for people to reveal their true thoughts without knowing who you were. Dinner service began. The attendants moved smoothly through the cabin, serving plates of food carefully arranged with silver cutlery. When Maria's turn came, she accepted the meal with gratitude, thanking the attendant with a genuine smile. The woman beside her, wearing sparkling earrings, gave her a brief look, almost as if waiting for Maria to make a mistake, perhaps to spill something or use the wrong fork. Maria noticed but continued eating calmly, with grace born not of wealth but of upbringing. As the meal went on, Maria began to feel the heaviness of the earlier moments lifting slightly. She reminded herself that these were strangers whose opinions had no lasting place in her life. She would land, meet her friend, and carry on. Their whispers would remain only in this cabin, fading away the moment the journey ended. Still, she knew deep inside that experiences like this were not meaningless. They left a mark, teaching lessons about the way society often measured worth through shallow lenses. Halfway through the flight, when the cabin lights dimmed and many passengers reclined to sleep, Maria leaned back, closed her eyes, and reflected on her life's journey. She thought of the little girl she had once been, walking barefoot through the dusty roads of her small town, carrying books home from school. That girl had never imagined sitting in first class on an international flight. Yet here she was, carrying the same humble spirit, even while surrounded by luxury. What pained her was not the doubt cast upon her seat but the reminder of how quickly people dismissed others who did not shine outwardly. She wished, silently, that one day more people would learn to look deeper, beyond clothes, beyond status, into the heart of a person. Suddenly, a small gesture caught her attention. A young attendant, perhaps newer than the others, approached her seat with a shy smile. "Ma'am," she whispered softly, "I just wanted to say I admire your patience. Not many people would have stayed so calm earlier. I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable." Her words were quiet, but sincere. Maria's heart warmed. She returned the smile and said, "Thank you, dear. There is nothing to forgive. You are only doing your job. We all learn, don't we?" The young attendant nodded gratefully, her eyes shining with respect, before walking away. That small exchange reminded Maria that kindness still existed, even in places filled with doubt. Hours passed, and the plane continued its journey across the skies. Some passengers still carried their quiet judgments, while others had lost interest. Maria sat in peace, drinking water, reading her book, and sometimes gazing at the stars through the small oval window. She held no anger in her heart, only a quiet strength that came from knowing who she truly was. If only the people around her had known the truth. If only they had realized that the simple woman they doubted was married to the man who owned the very airline carrying them across the skies. If only they understood that the seat she occupied was hers not because of wealth alone, but because life had brought her from humble beginnings to this moment with dignity intact. But Maria did not wish for them to know, at least not yet. She believed truth revealed itself in its own time. For now, she chose to remain as she was, a simple traveler, calm and graceful, walking through an experience that was painful in some ways, yet rich in lessons. And as the engines hummed and the night deepened outside, Maria promised herself one thing. She would carry this memory not as a wound but as a reminder. People may judge, people may whisper, but her worth would never be tied to their shallow glances. It was tied to her heart, her values, and the quiet strength with which she walked through life. The long flight finally came to an end. As the captain announced the landing, passengers sat upright, fastening their seat belts and preparing themselves for the arrival. Maria, too, put her book back into her bag and smiled softly, relieved that the journey was nearly over. The city lights twinkled below as the plane descended, and she whispered a silent prayer of thanks for a safe trip. When the plane touched the runway and slowed down, the cabin filled with the usual sounds: seat belts clicking, phones buzzing as people switched them on, and the shuffle of bags being pulled from overhead compartments. Maria waited calmly. She was never in a hurry to leave. She preferred to let the crowd rush ahead while she quietly took her turn. But even in those final moments, she could feel eyes on her. Some passengers still carried doubt in their looks, as if they believed she had somehow managed to get away with sitting in first class. Others were simply curious, wondering what her story might be. Maria felt those stares but ignored them with the same patience she had shown throughout the flight. As the cabin doors opened, the first-class passengers began to leave. The attendants stood near the exit, smiling and saying polite farewells. When Maria walked toward them, one of the senior attendants gave a stiff smile, but it was clear from her eyes that she had not forgotten the earlier doubt. Maria, as always, smiled warmly back and said, "Thank you for the flight." Her tone carried no bitterness, only genuine kindness. Outside the plane, the air was fresh with the smell of the airport. Passengers walked through the tunnel leading to the main terminal. Many hurried ahead, pulling expensive suitcases and checking their watches. Maria walked calmly, holding her bag on her shoulder, looking no different from the dozens of travelers around her. But something unexpected awaited her at the arrival gate. Standing there, tall and composed, was Richard himself. He had flown in early from his business trip just to welcome her. His presence was impossible to miss. He was a man of quiet authority, well-dressed but not flashy, his face familiar to many who followed the world of business and airlines. People often recognized him instantly: Richard Hayes, the billionaire owner of the very airline they had just flown on. The moment Maria saw him, her face lit up. She walked toward him, her steps quickening with joy. Richard's stern expression softened as soon as he saw her, and he opened his arms to welcome her. Without hesitation, Maria embraced him warmly, like a wife greeting her husband after days apart. For her, it was not about his wealth or status. It was about love. For him, it was the same. But for those around them, the scene was nothing less than shocking. Several passengers froze in their tracks, staring with wide eyes. The attendants who had doubted Maria earlier stood rooted to the ground, their smiles fading into expressions of disbelief. The man in the dark suit, who had whispered about her not belonging, almost dropped his bag. The woman beside him covered her mouth with her hand, unable to hide her astonishment. Whispers spread quickly. "Is that Richard Hayes?" someone muttered. "The airline owner." Another passenger gasped. "Wait, that woman, she's his wife." The realization rippled through the crowd like a wave. The flight attendants, now realizing the truth, exchanged nervous glances. They had not just doubted any random passenger, they had doubted the wife of the man who signed their paychecks, the very person who indirectly provided them with their jobs. Their hearts sank, knowing the situation could not be undone. Richard pulled back from the embrace and looked at Maria gently. "How was your flight, my love?" he asked. His voice carried warmth, but there was also a touch of concern in his eyes, as if he could already sense something had gone wrong. Maria hesitated for a moment. She could have told him everything right then: the whispers, the judgment, the humiliation of being asked to move to economy. But instead, she gave him a small smile. "It was fine," she said softly. "A little tiring, but fine." Richard studied her face carefully. He knew her too well. He could see the slight tiredness in her eyes, the subtle trace of discomfort she tried to hide. He understood without her needing to explain. He turned slightly toward the attendants standing nearby, and his sharp gaze swept over them. They immediately lowered their eyes, guilt written on their faces. In that brief silence, the truth spoke louder than words. The attendants knew that Richard had understood what had happened, even though Maria had chosen not to say it aloud. Richard's voice was calm but firm as he finally addressed them. "Every passenger deserves respect," he said quietly, his words measured but heavy with meaning. "Not because of how they look. Not because of what they wear. But because they are human beings who trusted you with their journey. Remember that." The attendants nodded quickly, murmuring apologies. Their faces burned with shame. The passengers who overheard the words shifted uncomfortably, realizing how wrongly they had judged Maria. Maria touched Richard's arm gently, signaling him not to continue further. She did not want anger or scolding. She wanted the lesson to settle in their hearts naturally. Richard, seeing the calm plea in her eyes, nodded and let it go. He placed his arm around her shoulders, guiding her forward through the terminal. Together, they walked ahead, leaving behind the stunned silence of those who had doubted her. For the passengers, the moment was unforgettable. The woman they had laughed at, whispered about, and dismissed as out of place had turned out to be someone far beyond their imagination. She had not only belonged in first class, she had been connected to the very heart of the airline itself. Some felt guilty for their behavior. Others simply stood speechless, their pride shrinking in the face of truth. For the attendants, the experience became a heavy lesson. They had treated a passenger with suspicion because of her simple appearance, only to discover she was the wife of their employer. But beyond the shock of her identity, what stayed with them was her dignity. Even when doubted, Maria had never raised her voice or acted arrogantly. She had remained patient and kind, teaching them by example what true class really meant. As Maria and Richard left the airport together, she leaned closer to him and whispered, "Please don't be too hard on them. They acted out of assumption, not malice. Let them learn from this." Richard smiled at her, admiring once again the strength of her heart. "You're too forgiving," he said softly. "But maybe that is what makes you stronger than all of us." Maria laughed gently. "Kindness is not weakness," she replied. "It is a different kind of power." And with that, they walked on, side by side, blending into the rhythm of life outside the airport. For Maria, the incident was already behind her. She carried no bitterness. Instead, she carried a hope that the people who had doubted her would remember this day and think twice before judging someone by their appearance again. Back in the terminal, however, the whispers continued. Passengers talked about what they had just witnessed, replaying the moment when the simple woman hugged the billionaire. The attendants gathered quietly, still shaken, promising themselves never to repeat such a mistake. That flight would remain etched in their memories forever, not because of turbulence or delay, but because of the lesson one woman's humility had silently taught them. The car ride home was quiet, the city lights flashing past the windows as Maria leaned back against the seat. Richard held her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her fingers in a silent gesture of comfort. He did not ask her for details, because he already knew enough. Her eyes had spoken more than her words ever could. Maria broke the silence first. "You looked worried when you saw me," she said softly. "I was," Richard admitted. "Something in your face told me this flight was not as peaceful as you wanted it to be. I could see it, even before you spoke." Maria smiled faintly. "You know me too well." He turned to her with concern. "Did they treat you unfairly?" She paused for a moment. Then, instead of giving him a full account, she said, "Let's just say they judged me by my clothes, not by my ticket. But it's all right now. It's over." Richard's jaw tightened. "It's not all right, Maria. No one, absolutely no one, should be treated like that, no matter who they are. If they can treat you this way, I can only imagine how they treat others who don't have a voice." Maria touched his arm gently. "That is why you must not be angry. Anger will only frighten them for a moment. What will truly change them is reflection. If they learn to see every passenger with respect, not just those who look wealthy, then something good will come from this." Her words softened his expression. He nodded slowly, realizing once again that Maria's strength lay not in power but in grace. "You're right," he whispered. "You always are." When they arrived home, Maria felt relief wash over her. The familiar scent of her garden roses greeted her as she stepped through the doorway. She changed into her simple cotton dress and walked out to the garden, where the night breeze carried the fragrance of blooming flowers. Richard followed her, standing quietly as she touched the petals of a rose with the same tenderness she had shown during the flight. "Do you ever regret living simply?" Richard asked suddenly. "Sometimes I wonder if things like this wouldn't happen if you dressed like the other wives, wore diamonds, or carried the handbags they expect." Maria turned to him with a gentle smile. "Regret? Never. If I wore diamonds only to gain respect, then I would be lying to myself. My simplicity is not weakness, it is my truth. And if people cannot see beyond clothes, that is their blindness, not mine." Richard looked at her with admiration. In that moment, he knew once again why he had fallen in love with her. She had never wanted him for his money, his power, or his position. She had wanted him for himself. And it was her refusal to let wealth change her that made her more extraordinary than any jewel. The next morning, Richard called a meeting with his senior airline staff. He did not mention Maria by name, but he spoke firmly about what he had seen. "Every passenger is important," he said. "Not because of what they wear or how they look, but because they trust us with their journey. If respect depends on outward appearance, then we are failing in our duty." His voice carried the weight of both authority and personal conviction. The staff listened carefully. Some of them had already heard whispers about what had happened on the flight, though none dared to speak of it openly. But the message was clear: the company would not tolerate judgment based on appearances. Training programs were revised, workshops were arranged, and attendants were reminded again and again that kindness was not optional, it was the foundation of the airline's service. For Maria, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. She continued to visit her garden, cook meals for Richard, and wear her simple dresses. But she carried the memory of that flight in her heart. Not as a wound, but as a reminder of how quickly people formed opinions without knowing the truth. She hoped those passengers would never forget the shock of seeing her with Richard, not because she wanted them embarrassed, but because she wished they would think twice before judging another traveler again. Weeks later, Maria received a letter from one of the attendants who had been on that flight. It was handwritten, filled with sincerity. The attendant apologized deeply for her behavior, admitting how wrong she had been to doubt Maria. She wrote, "That day taught me more than years of training ever could. You showed me what dignity really looks like, not through diamonds or anger, but through patience. I promise I will never look at a passenger the same way again." Maria read the letter with a warm heart. She placed it in her drawer, not as a trophy, but as proof that kindness could touch lives in ways one might never expect. She whispered a prayer for the young attendant, hoping she would carry the lesson forward for the rest of her life. Richard often teased Maria gently about becoming a silent teacher wherever she went. "You don't stand on a stage, you don't give lectures," he said, "yet somehow, you change people. Even without trying." Maria laughed softly. "I don't change people, Richard. Life changes them. I just happen to be part of the lesson." Her words stayed with him. In the world of business, he was used to quick results, sharp decisions, and strong commands. But Maria reminded him that sometimes the quietest actions left the deepest marks. For the passengers who had been on that flight, the story became one they told for years. Some admitted openly that they had misjudged her. Others spoke of how ashamed they felt when they saw her greet Richard. And a few, perhaps the most thoughtful, said that moment had changed the way they treated strangers forever. They had learned that humility did not erase worth, and that true class was not displayed through jewelry but through the calm dignity of a heart that refused to be shaken. Maria herself never spoke of the incident publicly. She did not care for attention, nor did she wish for anyone to feel humiliated. For her, the lesson was personal. It was about holding on to patience even when surrounded by misunderstanding. It was about choosing forgiveness instead of pride. Years later, when people asked her secret to happiness, she always gave the same answer: simplicity. Live simply, think kindly, and carry dignity in your heart. That is all. And those who truly knew her understood that it was not just words. It was the way she lived every single day. In the end, the story of the simple woman who was doubted on a flight became more than just a tale of misunderstanding. It became a reflection of something greater: the need for respect, the value of humility, and the reminder that appearances could never measure a person's true worth. Maria had walked through the experience without anger, without pride, and without revenge. And that was what made her unforgettable. For the airline, for the passengers, and for Richard himself, she remained a quiet teacher, showing that sometimes the greatest power in the world is the strength to remain kind, even when the world doubts you.